So we'll just go to next slide to introduce ourselves. I'm Bita Rais, Senior ESG Lead and Advisor. I have 15 years of experience working on both international and national projects with focus on social and human rights aspects. I've provided advice to developers and basic investors, including IFC and European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. I'm based in Montreal in Canada, and I'm sitting in the ESG strategy and climate change team. And I'll hand over to Matteo so he can also introduce himself. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Matteo Colella. I'm an ESG analyst on a part of the ESG strategy and reporting team within WSP Canada, which is about roughly 80 employees across Canada and across different ESG topics. I'm an analyst that mainly focuses on social issues, human rights, and sustainable finance. I have 3 years of experience working on international and Canadian projects. And I've advised public and private corporations on ESG strategy development and reporting throughout that time.
Thank you, Matteo. So just to go through briefly throughout the agenda, we start with human rights and net zero, what actually means, a little bit of a context. When they move forward to human rights and trends in 2023, we then present a case study, which we actually provided advice to a major utility company on assessing the human rights risks in the supply chain. And as part of that, we developed a guide tool. And then next, we're going to go through the solutions to address and manage the human rights risks. And towards the end, we're going to go through the key challenges and takeaways. And then we'll have the Q&A session at the end of our presentation. Next slide. So what is basic human rights and net zero? Just a little bit of a context. Next slide, Matteo. So a little bit of a context about the justifiable path to net zero and what actually means. As we move towards the net zero and just transition, there's more reliance on the renewable energy, including wind and solar. And as part of this industry, critical minerals, and basically they play a very, very important role. So some of these critical minerals, there are such as, lithium, cobalt, and copper. For example, lithium has been used in batteries, electric vehicles. You have the cobalt as well, and also copper for the transmission line. Some of these rare minerals and the extraction of them, they have been associated with human rights violations. And because of that issue, there has been a strong criticism on basically the kind of providing that justifiable path to net zero. So that's where that just transition comes in, where it's very important to manage the human rights risks within the supply chain. And basically throughout the supply chain, there is that end product and basically that raw material which is going to be extracted. And certainly those kind of human rights violations, and certainly some of those suppliers, they haven't followed the responsible mining practices. And therefore, as we see, human rights are increasingly becoming important. They're the core element of the SDGs, the UN guiding principles, and also the regulations such as the EU Corporate Due Diligence Directive, which they're requiring for companies and corporations to undertake a human rights due diligence. Next slide. So just to go back to a bit of a history about this kind of incident happened in 2020, which was related to the polysilicon, which is the raw material of the basic solar panel. And this raw material has been extracted in and associated with some of the forced labor issues in Xinjiang in China. And as a result of that, there were basically US, for example, Department of Labor banned the import of the solar panels. So as you see through the right-hand side, you have the kind of that supply chain process. You have the polysilicon raw material, then it's been converted to the wafer, cells, and modules. And the final product is a solar panel. And throughout this supply chain life cycle, it's very important to identify those human rights risks. And potentially, the forced labor has been a major reputational issue and damage for corporations. And also from the investor's perspective, there is going to be a high risk associated with human rights aspects when it comes to supply chain, and if there is that lack of management. However, having said that, this exposure to kind of human rights is not associated only to China or solar panel. We see that regularly throughout the supply chain, for example, in the manufacturing, in retail, and therefore the importance of this topic has been really focused on. Next slide. So just a little bit about human rights and trends in 2023. We talk about the next slide to kind of what has been the legislative response to human rights risks. And as we see throughout the kind of EU in 2023, we have the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, which they're requiring the corporations to provide human rights reports and to report on the human rights measures and also due diligence aspects. Also in the UK, we had the Modern Slavery Act in 2015, which as part of that, some organizations with the turnover, certain turnover, they have to produce a modern slavery statement report. In France, which has been also very strict, they have introduced the Duty of Vigilance Act in 2017, which it covers all the human rights aspects from modern slavery, forced labor, and also child labor aspects. Recently, also in Canada, the bill S211 has also been passed by Parliament, which that basically is also requiring corporations to provide human rights reporting to make sure that the measures are provided in terms of assessing the human rights risk in their supply chain. Next slide, thank you. In terms of the mega trends in ESG, to bring the kind of human rights as one of the core elements of the ESG, it's very, very important to kind of understand that international, national, and regional policies and regulations, they're basically shaped based on these mega trends, ESG mega trends. And we need to see that not only that based on these mega trends, we have to mitigate the human rights risk, but there's also an opportunity here which needs to be captured. And in terms of just transition, there are opportunities in terms of protecting the rights of the people to make sure you're creating opportunities for people. And therefore, those opportunities needs to also be captured as part of the just transition. Next slide, please. So now we're going to take you through a case study on human rights risks, which is the project we undertook for a major utility company in Canada. We basically looked into 3 steps we undertook as part of this project. The first step was to analyze their current human rights risk management mechanism. So we took a very holistic view in terms of managing the human rights aspects. We looked into their corporate strategies, policies to identify those gaps in their policies and procedures and also in their sustainability strategies, to where those gaps are in terms of managing the human rights aspects. And towards the end, we provided an action plan of how to fill those gaps in terms of resources, for example, whether they need a new process, a new procedure. And towards the kind of the gap identification, that was the second task came along, which was to identify and to develop that risk assessment tool, which looked into the product categories, at country level, the sector level, which Matthew later is going to describe in detail how this guide tool has been established in terms of managing the human rights risk in the supply chain. And lastly, we look into the solutions and measures in terms of development of a traceability system, which was a kind of a pilot traceability model for a solar panel in line with the Solar Industries Associations, SEIA. And towards that kind of traceability kind of a system, we provided the mitigation measures and the solutions, how to improve the human rights practice. So I'll hand over, just also before I hand over to Matto, this also to bring into attention that throughout this practice and throughout this study and project we undertook, we also looked into other corporations such as EDF, Apple, Total Energy, and to look into what they have done in terms of management of the human rights aspect. For example, Apple, they produced a human rights policy, but they also have a human rights due diligence guideline in accordance with the UN guiding principle. They have also considerably collaborated with Responsible Mining Initiative, which is a platform in terms of the third-party assurance. EDF provided a guidance document specifically for their supplier to make sure they are developing the capacity of their supplier. So throughout this establishment of this risk management tool, risk assessment tool, we also looked into these major corporations. So I'll hand over to Matto so he can take you through the risk assessment guide tool. Thank you.
Thanks, Peta. So I'll just go through the methodology and how we assessed human rights risk for the client within their supply chain. So ultimately, what guided our approach, we wanted to have a sector agnostic approach, and we were guided by the UNEP-FI, which is the UN Environment Program Finance Initiative, and the guiding principles. And this provided us a good foundation for understanding and taking on this project to assess the human rights risk within a supply chain. And through this, we used multiple sources. We had a holistic way of looking at human rights for each of within the supply chain. And we wanted to have multiple sources to look at the different layers involved within this supply chain to assess that risk rather than leaving one source. We required many to have information and sources that were reputable. So what we did was we initially began by reviewing the client's purchase categories. This was roughly 50 categories across more than 500 different products. You can see on the right there just an example of the product diversity. You could have things that are like office furniture, batteries, cables, IT support. So there was various and a diverse variety of products across each of the product categories, which these were sorted into sectors for us to later evaluate. And then following that grouping, we developed the risk assessment methodology using those sources we listed there, and that we'll get into further, as well as defining the human rights risk indicators to assess the indicators based on their presence to determine the sector risk. And then following this, we looked at a broad scope. We looked from country, sector, supplier, and product risk to bring those each together to have an overall final risk assessment. And then that would identify corresponding mitigation measures and a risk profile for that given product category. And this could be used as valuable inputs for human rights reporting as it's growing in both regulatory requirements, as we mentioned earlier, and as well as in ESG reporting through SASB, GRI, and as well as the IFRS. And so just to give an idea of the methodology we used to this holistic perspective, we had a combination of looking at giving individual scores between country risk, sector risk, supplier risk, and the product risk, each with their own methodologies that I'll get into further, as well as different sources. And together we took this approach to add them together to get a total final risk classification. And you can see below the different risk profiles when those scores all each added together. This was just to provide the client with a high-level profile of the mitigation measures, the specific reputational risk, and as well as guiding some engagement with the supplier should they want to continue the contracts. And so just to provide the methodology for how we looked into the country risk, we used the Global Slavery Index, which is published by the Walk Free organization. And the Global Slavery Index looks at the prevalence of modern slavery using both government and independent data that is aggregated together. And this is given for each country, over 180 countries across the globe, as well as taking into account the governance requirements and response by the local governments. And so we began mapping with the client's purchase supplier country of origin. We mapped based on that to assess and then you can see this on the right, just to indicate the different countries that the supplier may be located. And we divided the entire list of all the countries into quartiles, and those were given corresponding risk classifications based on their prevalence of modern slavery. So for example, in the first quartile would be very high, you can see there below. And just to provide a little note, within China, for example, we identified China as high risk, even though under this classification it would be medium risk. And this was taken into the context and the priorities of the client. And this shows that you really need to tailor suit some of your assessments, because you may want to have a lower tolerance for certain risks. And this was an example of that. The second aspect we looked into for the holistic view was the sector risk, and we use UNGP's methodology on this, where they have provided across different sectors a list of over 50 human rights risk indicators. And so our assessment of the sector risk began with the identification of which human rights risk indicators were present in each of the sectors, as well as an assessment, a WSP assessment of the severity of that human rights issue within the sector, as well as taking into context the prevalence or connection of the raw material extraction, because that does come with higher risk and often exploitation of labor. We wanted to highlight that and elevate that for areas that were more closely tied, or products that were more closely tied to raw material extraction. So for example, like general manufacturing or oil and gas, which might be more close to that raw material and accompanied by those risks. And this was, and as we matched the products within each sector, they were given this accompanying sector risk for the sector that they matched within. Then the next stage we looked at the supplier risk, and these were assessed through a combination of the EU, US, and Canadian sanction or entity list that they have available. This is a very high level assessment, just that could be incorporated into the client's existing methodology and screening for suppliers, just to look at and vet out any potential high risk suppliers. As well as we looked at a media search through multiple different sources, including Amnesty International and the Business and Human Rights Resource Center. And I think the key point to take away on supplier risk is that the best way to stay on top of that and managing your human rights risk within suppliers is to have ongoing monitoring and updates, specifically within these blacklists, because they can change frequently, and as well as understanding the supply chain of your suppliers to better understand what sort of risk may lie within your tier 3 or onwards suppliers. And the final aspect we looked at was the product risk, and we assessed this through multiple sources. We initially began with looking at the U.S. Department of Labor's relevant exploitative labor product list, which is a list of products by country that are associated with exploitative labor. And so we used this list to initially determine what were high risk or very high risk products. And also we had made assessments on other products because this had covered a wide range of products. We looked at other products and did similar approaches to assessing the risk based on the connection and association with raw material extraction of those critical minerals. Because, for example, cobalt was not on this list at the time, and so it's taking into account that context and using as many sources as possible to have a wide scope of your assessment and be as accurate as possible. And also we took into account the purchase volumes associated with each product. So this gave us the depth of that engagement that should be required, as well as the perhaps the divestment or recommendation on based on how high or the purchase volume may be. And now I'll just hand it off to Bita to talk about solutions to address and manage human rights risk.
Next slide, Matthew, please. So just to bring a little bit of context into the solutions and also mitigation measures we propose as part of this project, we looked into different stages of their procurement, and for each stage we produced a kind of a human rights risk mitigation measure. So if you start from your supply chain mapping, analysis and strategy, we then propose the supplier qualification strategy for human rights risk contracts. And when you go to the calls for proposal, they have to make sure that there is a questionnaire and there are those human rights indicators that are incorporated into the proposals and into the bids. Then it comes to the tender, when they have to communicate that with that particular supplier, they have to make sure the human rights clauses in line with the UN guiding principle has been included in those clauses. And certainly some of the challenge associated with this kind of mitigation measures and communication with the suppliers is that they may not be aware of the human rights basically risk. They may not be aware about the, for example, UN guiding principles. So as a kind of a corporation and entity, the engagement with suppliers and to make sure that that kind of a capacity development is an important aspect. We also produced a questionnaire checklist, which is a very important aspect from the supplier screening. When you undertake that supplier screening, that could be the first layer in terms of assessing the human rights kind of risks associated with that supplier. And certainly when they fill that questionnaire, then you can categorize whether that supplier can basically meet the requirements of the human rights criteria or they cannot. So there is that kind of a go, no go process which needs to be followed by corporations. And so as we see in this kind of a graph, we try to kind of progress that to make sure that different stages, from the contract award to kind of the proposal and kind of the bid and tender, all those human rights indicators are incorporated and integrated. And this is about the integration of the human rights in the wider sustainability strategy. And it's not just when it comes to that particular supplier, but as part of that communication with the supplier and conveying that message that corporations, they are in line with the UN guiding principle, it's important that they have a human rights policy, for example. They have a procedure in place in terms of management of those human rights aspects. And certainly part of this also is the implementation of a traceability system, which has already been, that guidance document has already been produced for solar panel as a pilot by the SEIA, Solar Energy Industries Associations. So I will talk about that traceability system in the next slide. So traceability system, it's a bit of a complex kind of a framework, but at the same time, it brings that kind of visibility to suppliers. So if you have a direct suppliers, you have a visibility who that supplier is. But when it comes to that tier 3 supplier, the corporation, they don't have any visibility. So they have to make sure that they collect data from, for example, the raw material extraction to that final product. And therefore, kind of following that traceability framework is going to be key. So the step one is that traceability in product design. So that kind of supplier collection of the data from polysilicon to solar panel, which is the final product. And step two is that supply chain mapping, because it's very important that the list of suppliers across the tiers are clear and transparent. And defining that supply chain sourcing from materials to that final assembly. So they have to map the kind of the process and map all their suppliers that they're covered from the raw material extraction to final product. And step three is about that kind of procurement process, the data sheet that you produce, the data requirements, and that needs to be communicated with all the suppliers. The stakeholder engagement also is a very important aspect as mentioned. So in terms of communication with the suppliers, it's important to increase their capacity when it comes to the human rights and to kind of convey what are your eligibility criteria in terms of the assessment of the human rights aspects. So this traceability protocol at the moment is available for solar panel, but for any other kind of sector and industry can be implemented. It doesn't have to be the comprehensive traceability framework, but if that kind of a process and the procedure is going to be followed, it's going to be very beneficial for companies. Next slide, Matthew. So here we provided a kind of a mitigation measure and a solution in terms of providing that kind of a holistic view to look into that kind of human rights aspect. So you look into your corporate strategy, policy, resources, and then you have that due diligence that needs to be undertaken to make sure that you identify those very high human rights risks. You have the stakeholder engagement, which is going to be ongoing with all the basically key stakeholders, with the communities, with NGOs, with third parties, and also the supplier engagement, as mentioned, it could be a direct, it could be through a digital platform, but to make sure that you have that engagement as an ongoing process with your suppliers. And third-party assessment is very critical in terms of when it comes to the audit, when you want to monitor the kind of the human rights aspects. It's important you have that third-party assessment And capacity building, as mentioned, some of the companies, they have provided a very good guide for human rights impact assessment, which provides that kind of a knowledge to stakeholders in terms of the capacity building aspect. So next slide, we can briefly talk about the key challenges and takeaways. So Matthew, if you want to go start and
Yeah,
forward
sure.
from
Thank you.
key challenges, yeah.
So some of the major challenges that we address pretty frequently throughout the project and assessing a supply chain's worth of human rights risk was having that visibility and monitoring ability across suppliers and the supply chains can vary greatly. This can vary at even just the supplier level, but also through different companies because you may be dealing with different sectors which have different norms in terms of the collection of this data or even the availability of this data. So having that data has always been a determining factor to have the accurate assessment, and it can really vary greatly across projects. And so having a consistent data or monitoring method for your own supply chain is really important in terms of being able to do something similar in either your company or your own case. And then another challenge, sorry.
Just to add that kind of the kind of visibility, I think in terms of the data visibility, it's a very complex aspect, especially when it comes to the tier 3 suppliers, because the corporation, they know, for example, who those direct suppliers are, but to access to those tier 3 suppliers, which that's where, you know, the risk of the human rights could be very severe in terms of when it comes to going to kind of those raw material extractions, which mines, for example, those raw data has been extracted from, it could be quite complex.
And then another challenge we had was monitoring and assessing it. Assessing human rights is very multi-layered and complex. There is, like Beta just said, like you have direct suppliers and indirect suppliers that all have different requirements from their own tenders or their own contracts, and it can be quite difficult to get that full transparency. And so looking at that holistically as we did here can be a good proxy in terms of defending yourself against any reputational risk because of the fact that this is very multi-layered and very complex, as well as often unmonitored or even data just does not exist for certain areas.
Yeah, so in terms of that kind of a risk assessment tool that's been developed, that could be, you know, it could be used as a kind of a very initial layer to make sure that you understand which sectors that basically the suppliers they operate, which sectors are high risk sectors, which products, for example, they're blacklisted. So that kind of holistic view, and also at the country level, those data are very crucial to kind of make that judgment and make that assessment about the human rights aspect. So it's not just particularly certain local area or certain project, but certainly you have to take into account the higher level, you know, from the strategy point of view, the countries, and kind of also regulations as well are very important when it comes to those aspects.
As well, another challenge, it can be also in the data volumes. It can be quite substantial and require a lot of manual analysis that really requires almost the leverage of a digital tool that may be able to save time or save the analysis of thousands of lines of documents, looking through payment receipts as well as monitoring that. So having that initial data tracking and management is really useful at the company level, but also as well as for suppliers, just to manage that data for when you're trying to analyze it within human rights.
Yeah, definitely. In terms of takeaways, so we talked about the tools and, you know, approaches that can be used. So the due diligence process is very important when it comes to certainly kind of assessing, you know, potentially investment risks and also high risk human rights aspects. So it's important that you have that kind of ongoing due diligence. It's basically going to be implemented for those high risk and suppliers which have been identified as part of the supply chain mapping. And certainly human rights can be broken down, assessed holistically to kind of to navigate through those complex supply chain aspects. And mapping a supply chain, as mentioned throughout that traceability framework, is a key important aspects of that, understanding who are those high-risk suppliers are. Anything else in terms of the key takeaways, or I think?
No, that's perfect. I think the main part is that because of the complexity and the data requirements for some of these massive supply chains, breaking it down in terms of what information you have available and what information or methodologies you can leverage is one of the best ways to navigate this area and address your own and manage your own human rights risk. And I think that's about it for me.
Okay, so just in terms of the questions, if there are any questions, you can.
Sure, thank you, Bita and Matteo, for a fantastic presentation. So just mentioning the housekeeping items quickly, the presentation slides are available to download in the handout box on the GoToWebinar control panel, and you can continue to log your questions in the question box on the control panel. I will start with the first question. This is regarding best practices. What are some of the best practices or case studies of companies managing and addressing their human rights risks in their supply chain?
I think many companies, just to answer this question, many companies have started to kind of, take that into account as we kind of looked into a kind of major corporations such as, Total Energy, EDF, and Apple. They have produced a comprehensive number of documents and case studies and best practices and how they want to kind of manage their suppliers. They even went further in terms of providing a supplier human rights risk assessment guidance, which they have basically communicated that guidance to their suppliers to make sure that their suppliers, they're going to be trained and they're going to kind of increase their capacity and understanding of the human rights risks. Because of many of the suppliers, they may not have, kind of that knowledge or full knowledge in line with the UN guiding principles. And certainly UN guiding principles process has been used as the main one of the kind of best practices in terms of protect and respect and remedy. It's really focusing on the kind of those salient human rights aspects and how companies and corporations they can mitigate those salient human rights issues. So the human rights impact assessment and also risk assessment is now becoming very common in terms of when developers they undertake the impact assessment is now basically integrated into the impact assessment methodology. So certainly some of the best practices are already been followed by some of the major corporations as we looked into them. Yeah.
And I think also a major area of best practices can be in that capacity building, because looking within your own organization, looking at the resources you have available, doing your due diligence is a great way to minimize and mitigate your human rights risk, but actually supporting and providing that strategy for your own suppliers to bump up capacity or resources or have tools available to them to make it so that they can provide data that's useful to not only yourself, but also the supplier through other contracts they may have or to manage their own risk.
Thank you. The next question is about effective supply chain management. It goes like this: how can companies engage and collaborate with their suppliers to have the most effective supply chain management?
There are certain mechanisms in place. So for example, some companies they already have a platform, online platform, which they have set up in terms of when the suppliers they're going to be involved in a bid or the procurement kind of a proposal or RFP. There is that questionnaire has already been communicated in their own platform. So there is a kind of a specific platform only for suppliers and for the procurement, which has been developed by some companies. And certainly the supplier that is going to be eligible can log in and can basically look into those questionnaire checklists to understand what is required from them in terms of the human rights aspects. For example, if they have a code of conduct in place, if they have a risk assessment process in place, if they have policies or procedures in place. So there are for kind of major corporations, which there are little bit more developed in terms of assessment of the human rights aspects. they have that tool, a kind of online tool, to be able to undertake that effective communication. However, having said that, also there are regular engagement in terms of monitoring and management of risks. Throughout the supply chain management, there has to be a kind of audit, external audit, to be undertaken by third-party assessment, particularly if it's been investigated that there could be, potential forced labor issues. There could be potential non-compliances, and therefore, as a result of that, those audits, annual audit needs to be undertaken.
Thank you. What are the emerging trends and challenges in the supply chain and human rights?
I think at the moment, the kind of access to data is a very complex issue, especially as mentioned with the direct suppliers. That kind of communications already, that engagement, it already exists. But when it comes to the tier 3 type of suppliers, which they are end suppliers, access to data is very complex. So, and many corporations, they don't have the visibility across their supply chain process. They don't know, for example, who's the end supplier is. There are certain kind of tools being developed for example, food industry, but at the moment, many corporations, they are looking into different technologies to be able to access to the data for their end suppliers.
Yeah, digital tools are absolutely a massive trend. I think you can say that about ESG in general. Digital, everyone is looking for and investigating what tools can be available to help companies more efficiently manage their own impacts, and human rights is really no different in that aspect. The demand is definitely there, but there are tools that are coming out, but the issue, and I think we had it on the challenges, is the methodologies are not consistent. There isn't a universal methodology to an approach like this, and it likely won't exist because you have to really fit a management process like this, and it has to be tailored to your own context, your own supply chain, as well as your company. And understanding that and tailoring a digital tool to that is no different, but it can provide really useful data and really manage your risks effectively.
Thank you. I will take the last question. What major NGOs or organizations are leading in this area, especially in providing data and methodologies, or change the norm for what is expected of companies?
Basically, the main kind of a process and methodology has been used. The Danish Institute for Human Rights, they have developed very good toolboxes and on human rights management and risk assessment, which I've used basically their kind of a process and methodology previously, but also UN guiding principles, they have their own mechanism in terms of how corporations, they have to undertake human rights impact assessment. But the UN, basically the Danish Institute also has got very, very good beneficial methodologies to, and also, for example, they have a human rights checklist questionnaire, which basically can be used.
And I also think the Business and Human Rights Resource Center is really a useful source as well. They provide a lot of really great thought leadership, as well as methodologies and frameworks and information. Especially there's a lot of useful information on human rights and similar things to like the prevalence, as well as predictions and really useful information that can really be insightful for a lot of companies.
Thank you. All additional questions will be answered directly by the presenters later via email. So thanks everyone for joining us today. Thank you, Bita and Matteo, for your presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you for the attendees for joining us. You can feel free to reach out to the presenters via the contact details shown on the screen, and we hope to see you in our upcoming sessions. So thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you.